The Selma campaign was far from over, and people were still joining. A Detroit housewife was about to leave the safety and comfort of her home and risk everything for her beliefs. She would be the only white woman to be murdered in the civil rights movement. She would also be the only martyr to die twice. Viola Liuzzo was a different kind of martyr. She was the only white woman to be murdered while participating in the civil rights movement. And she was the only person to be killed twice. After her life was snuffed out, her reputation was destroyed. To this day, her memorial, though made of granite, is fragile. And even iron bars struggle to protect her memory.
Even as young children, we knew that our mom was different from the other moms that we knew. She was spontaneous, she was playful, she was not regimented into the housewife routine.
Viola Liuzzo was different from many of the mothers in Detroit. For one thing, she was a daughter of the South, growing up in Georgia and Tennessee.
She grew up in the Jim Crow South. She saw discrimination firsthand, and she knew that she was as poor or poorer than many of the people who were discriminated against, but she did not feel that same sting.
Even when she moved to Detroit, Viola never stopped caring about people who were less fortunate. But she got married and became a mother of 5, and that became her passion.
She was magical. Our holidays were magical, our birthdays were magical. She'd take us kids out in the summer during the day, and we'd all get home just in time to kind of straighten up the house before my dad got home, because Mom said the house will be here a long time after I will, and we can do better things with our time.
Viola admired people who committed themselves to the civil rights movement. When the Selma campaign began, she followed it carefully. On March 7th, 1965, she found herself watching the same televised footage that had stirred Reverend James Reeb. When Reeb was killed, Viola Liuzzo cried, and then began to pack for a journey to Selma, Alabama. Her husband Jim was concerned, but did not try to stop her. Viola drove her Oldsmobile some 800 miles from Detroit to Selma to participate in history. After 2 failed attempts by Martin Luther King and the civil rights marchers to walk from Selma to Montgomery, they were finally successful, thanks in large part to the protection they received from President Johnson, who sent in federal troops. On March 25th in Montgomery, after a 3-day march, the demonstrators gathered at the Capitol. Despite the suffering that marred the journey, they were jubilant.
We're on the move now. Yes, sir. The beating and killing of our clergymen and young people will not divert us. We're on the move now. Yes, sir.
At the conclusion of the march, Viola Liuzzo shuttled weary protesters back to Selma. She was accompanied by a young black man named Leroy Moulton. But there were Klansmen in Selma. They had been sent to keep the marchers under surveillance and were enraged the march had been successful. As Liuzzo and Moulton headed back to Montgomery, a carload of Klansmen spotted the pair at a stoplight.
They were a perfect symbol of everything the South hated the most at that point in time: an outside agitator mixing with black people.
The Klansmen followed Liuzzo's car along Highway 80 for 20 miles. Then on this very same stretch of road, pulled alongside and fired shots. As the car went out of control, it crashed into an embankment. Leroy, who played dead when the Klansmen stopped to check their work, was injured but survived. Viola had been shot in the head and died instantly. Within hours, the Liuzzo family learned the awful truth.
I don't know how to tell you what that feels like, to hear something like that. And you don't ever, I know that people think that it's been a long time, but you don't ever really forget that shock. It kind of never goes away.
Just days after her murder, in an unusual move, President Johnson himself announced a break in the hunt for the killers.
Arrests were made a few minutes ago of 4 Ku Klux Klan members in Birmingham, Alabama, charging them with conspiracy to violate the civil rights of the murdered woman.
The reason the Klansmen had been identified so quickly was because one of the 4 men in the car was an FBI informant, Gary Rowe.
Hoover and the Birmingham FBI were criticized because the question was asked, why would an FBI informant who was in the car not try to stop the murder? And so Hoover was very upset about that criticism.
The FBI's use of paid Klan informants created a public relations quandary for Hoover and the Bureau. The FBI had been relying on these informants to infiltrate the Klan ever since the murders of the 3 civil rights workers the summer of '64. But there was really no way to control the activities of the informants. Hoover was worried the FBI would appear responsible for the tragedy. For on the very day of the Liuzzo murder, Klan informant Gary Rowe had telephoned a warning to his FBI contact. Rowe reported that violence was planned. After the killings, Hoover sought to bury this fact. He launched a public relations smokescreen. Viola Liuzzo would be falsely portrayed as a bad mother, a drug addict, and promiscuous.
This is the case where there's a systematic, deliberate effort, almost a conspiracy, to destroy this person, not just physical, but to destroy her family, her memory.
Hoover not only had his staff leak his speculations about Viola Liuzzo to the press, but to the Klan as well. But President Johnson, who was frequently at odds with Hoover over the civil rights movement, was enraged at the death of Viola Liuzzo. As a direct result, he ordered Congress to begin a thorough investigation of the Klan. Johnson declared war.
I have fought them all my life because I believe them to threaten the peace of every community where they exist. I shall continue to fight them because I know their loyalty is not to the United States of America, but instead to a hooded society of bigots.
When 3 Klansmen were indicted for the murder, the state had a strong case. After all, the 4th man in the car was a paid informant and was an eyewitness to the killing. Leroy Moton would also testify about what he witnessed. But the Klansman's attorney delivered a scathing renunciation of the murder victim, a white woman who was in a car with a black man. The defense also attacked the credibility of the FBI's Klan informant, Gary Rowe.
The defense said that here was a man who put his hand on the Bible and swore the Klan oath of secrecy and broke that oath, and therefore he could not be trusted no matter what he said. And the jury took that very seriously.
The case ended in a hung jury, and during the retrial, court watchers, journalists, and America heard the all-too-familiar refrain. An all-white jury delivered a verdict of not guilty. But finally, the U.S. Justice Department brought federal indictments against the 3 men. They were charged with conspiracy to violate Viola Liuzzo's civil rights, and in December of 1965, a federal grand jury found them guilty. They were sentenced to the maximum 10 years in prison. The death of Viola Liuzzo, as well as those of Reverend James Reeb and Jimmy Lee Jackson, were not in vain. In addition to the court victory in the Liuzzo case, there was a major civil rights triumph. In response to the deaths and the publicity generated by the Selma to Montgomery March, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act on July 9, 1965. The bill outlawed obstacles to black voting and authorized federal officials to enforce fair voting practices.